They fought for freedom, for their people, for a world without tyranny. They carried rifles, radios, and hope. Some wore medals. Some wore disguises. Most wore nothing but courage. They weren't supposed to be soldiers, but they fought anyway. And when the Nazis caught them, they weren't treated as prisoners of war. They weren't given rights. They weren't even seen as human. They became objects of punishment, targets of vengeance, and symbols to be erased from history. For decades, what happened to them was considered too disturbing to speak about, too shameful, too unspeakable. But now we speak. This is the buried truth about what the Nazis did to captured female soldiers. If you've never been here before, you're right on time. Hit subscribe, and let's uncover what was buried. Chapter 1. The women who weren't supposed to fight. They were daughters, wives, teachers. Then they picked up rifles. Before the war, women in most countries were told the same thing. The battlefield is not your place. Your job is to wait, to heal, to support from the sidelines. But history doesn't obey boundaries, especially when evil invades your home. When the Axis powers swept through Europe, North Africa, and Asia, countless women looked at what was happening and said one word: no. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't ask if they were allowed. They fought. France in occupied France. Teenagers like Simone Seguin carried revolvers in bicycle baskets and ambushed German patrols in broad daylight. She later recalled, "I was 17. I didn't think about fear. Only duty." Thousands of French women joined the resistance, not as supporters, but as central operatives. They blew up train tracks, smuggled weapons, hacked radio transmissions, hid Allied soldiers in cellars and barns, and led full-scale sabotage campaigns. Poland in Poland. Under Nazi occupation, Poland became the nerve center of resistance in Eastern Europe, and Polish women were among its fiercest defenders. Wanda Gertz, a woman of noble descent, disguised herself as a man to join the army. She eventually commanded a battalion of fighters. And then there were the Polish Girl Guides, aged 12 to 18, who risked their lives carrying messages and weapons between units. They were nicknamed the Little Postmen. What they faced, if caught, wasn't prison. It was death. Russia in the Soviet Union. The USSR mobilized women at a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. 800,000 Soviet women served on the front lines. They worked as machine gunners, tank drivers, medics, and snipers. Over 2,000 became pilots, flying bombing runs deep into enemy territory. One of the most feared, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a sniper with 309 confirmed kills. So feared by the Nazis that her name appeared on enemy radio broadcasts, labeling her Lady Death. But what happened if they were captured? Unlike male soldiers, who, if lucky, were sent to POW camps, female fighters were treated as traitors to nature itself. To the Nazi regime, a woman with a weapon represented more than resistance. She represented defiance of their ideology. Women were supposed to be the breeders of the Reich, not the ones firing bullets at it. And so, when female soldiers were captured, they were subjected to what can only be described as institutionalized cruelty. They weren't seen as warriors. They weren't even seen as human. And that's when the worst began. Chapter 2, marked for elimination. Why Hitler feared female fighters. To Hitler, a woman who fought was more dangerous than a man. She broke the system from both ends. Hitler's vision of womanhood was rigid, terrifying, and absolute. In Nazi Germany, women were expected to be mothers of the master race, obedient wives, domestic caretakers of the Third Reich. This wasn't just cultural, it was policy. In speeches, Hitler declared, "The mission of women is to be beautiful and to bring children into the world." And so when women, especially foreign women, picked up rifles, set explosives, or gave orders to men, they didn't just break Nazi rules. They shattered the very foundation of Hitler's ideology. The Nazi reaction: unnatural, undeserving, unworthy. Captured female soldiers, whether Soviet snipers, Polish couriers, or French saboteurs, weren't classified as prisoners of war. They were labeled with terms like Terroristin, female terrorist. Untermenschen, subhuman female. Wehrkraftzersetzend, underminers of military morale. And that language mattered, because it meant these women could be executed without trial, sent to death camps instead of POW camps, experimented on without consequence, tortured during interrogation with impunity. In a 1942 Gestapo report from Warsaw, an officer wrote, "We do not record the names of captured female partisans. They are not to be treated as soldiers. The Soviet sniper they feared." One Nazi officer recalled a terrifying moment during the Battle of Sevastopol. A woman had picked off 6 German officers in under 20 minutes. No one could see her. She was like a ghost. Her name? Ludmila Pavlichenko. She later said, "I was fighting not only as a soldier, but as a woman. They didn't expect us to shoot back." She was captured only briefly during a separate incident, but her reputation sent waves of panic through Nazi camps. Why? Because the idea of a woman like her surviving, or worse, inspiring others, was unthinkable to the Reich. Eugenics, cruelty, and the war on defective femininity. To understand how far the Nazis were willing to go, we have to look at their pseudoscience, specifically Nazi eugenics. They believed courage in women was a mutation, female rebellion was a mental disorder, and any woman who fought should be cleansed from the gene pool. This was not metaphor. It became policy in many camps. SS doctors used captured female soldiers for sterilization experiments. Why? Because they saw them as a genetic threat. Women from Eastern Europe, in particular, were labeled racially inferior and psychologically unstable. One Soviet nurse wrote in her smuggled journal, "They treated me like I was diseased, not because I was sick, but because I didn't cry when they threatened me." But for the women who weren't executed on sight, the true horror began on the trains. Trains that didn't go to barracks, but to cages. Chapter 3, The Trains to Nowhere, How Captured Women Were Transported Like Cargo. They thought the worst was over when they were captured. They were wrong. After arrest came the transport. But this was not transportation. It was a slow-motion execution, stretched across days. Captured women, whether they were resistance fighters, nurses, or messengers, were often denied any formal sentencing. There was no trial, no uniforms, no recognition as prisoners of war. They were simply disappeared. And what followed was hell on wheels. The trains women were shoved into. Freight cars meant for livestock. Often 60 to 80 people crammed into a space built for 20. With no ventilation, no toilets, no water. In the summer, the cars became ovens. In the winter, freezers. Some trips lasted over a week. No food. No stops. Pregnant women died standing. Old women collapsed and were trampled. Young girls whispered prayers, or simply went silent forever. Eyewitness testimony. Anna W., a Polish courier captured in Krakow, later described it. "We weren't people. We were meat. We had no names, no voices. Just the sound of breathing and the stink of urine and death." Another survivor, Marta K., said, "By the time the doors opened, I could no longer remember where I was taken from. I only knew where I had arrived, and that it was the end of my life. Dead on arrival." When the doors finally creaked open, guards often found bodies frozen stiff, mothers holding lifeless babies, women who had clawed at the wood until their fingernails tore off. And yet, there were no records. These women's deaths weren't logged. Their names weren't written. Their stories vanished, like vapor in winter. No protections. Under the Geneva Conventions, captured soldiers, even from enemy forces, are to be transported humanely. But Nazi Germany withdrew those rights from female fighters by claiming they were not soldiers. They were insurgents. Or worse, women pretending to be men. That legal trick allowed for torture, inhumane conditions, summary executions, forced labor assignments without trial. Survivor quote. Lena S., a 19-year-old Jewish fighter from Belarus, wrote in her post-war memoir, I wasn't scared of the train. I was scared of surviving the ride. But the trains weren't the end. They were just the beginning of something darker. A place built for women, but not for life. Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück, the camp built for women, but never meant to hold them. There were no gas chambers at first, because they weren't planning for anyone to survive long enough to need one. Most people have heard of Auschwitz. Fewer know about Ravensbrück. And yet, for tens of thousands of women, especially captured female soldiers, this was the final stop. Built in 1939, just before war exploded across Europe, Ravensbrück wasn't an afterthought. It was custom designed by the Nazis to be a camp only for women. That made it unique. That made it deadly. Because every inch of it was engineered to degrade, disorient, and destroy the people inside it, not just physically, but psychologically. Where was Ravensbrück? Located 90 kilometers north of Berlin. Surrounded by forest, isolated, silent, easy to hide. Contained over 40 satellite camps that fed into its system. Over the course of the war, more than 130,000 women passed through its gates. Only about 15,000 survived. Who was sent there? The Nazis filled Ravensbrück with political prisoners, female resistance fighters, Soviet medics and snipers, women from captured territories, Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Ukraine, the Netherlands, Jewish, Romani, and Jehovah's Witness women. Women who had refused sexual advances from Nazi officers. And even nuns and social workers accused of helping partisans. Some were guilty of nothing more than handing out anti-Nazi pamphlets. Others had attacked Nazi convoys with grenades. But the guards didn't differentiate. To them, every woman here was disposable. Inside the camp, each wooden barrack was designed to hold 150 people. By 1944, some held 800. Beds were stacked 3 or 4 high. Fleas, lice, mice, rats. No blankets, no soap, no heat. One toilet for over 300 women. They were forced awake at 4:30 a.m. Counted in freezing temperatures. Beaten for moving too slowly. Forced to stand for hours with urine streaming down their legs, afraid to shift. The food. A single piece of bread. A sliver of margarine. Some days, soup made from boiled turnips. Malnutrition wasn't a side effect, it was strategy. Guards called it soft extermination. The work. Captured women were forced to dig trenches for incoming German troops, carry bricks until their spines cracked, sew uniforms for soldiers, manufacture bullets and bombs in underground factories, test military fabrics by wearing frozen clothes for hours. One woman remembered, "They used us to test winter coats. If you didn't freeze to death, the coat passed." The guards. Most of Ravensbrück's guards were women from the SS auxiliary forces. Some of the most brutal names include Dorothea Binz, who personally trained other female guards in torture techniques. Herta Botha, nicknamed the sadist of Ravensbrück. Hildegard Lachert, known for beating pregnant women until they miscarried. These women weren't brainwashed. They were willing participants in a system of destruction. And they especially despised female soldiers. Because those women didn't cower. They stared back. They fought back, even without weapons. And that made them a threat. Diary fragment. Found in a crumbling notebook hidden in the lining of a jacket, a Polish resistance fighter wrote, "I do not fear death. I fear forgetting who I am. They scream at us, 'You are nothing.' But I remember who I was. A fighter. A woman. Not theirs." But what happened in the medical ward was even worse than what happened in the mud. Because in Ravensbrück, some women weren't just starved. They were experimented on, like lab animals. The experiments, breaking the body, silencing the spirit. They weren't prisoners. They weren't even people. They were data points in a nightmare no one consented to. There was a building at Ravensbrück that inmates came to fear more than any guard, any punishment, any train. It was labeled simply, the infirmary. But what happened inside wasn't medicine. It wasn't healing. It was destruction disguised as science. Because in the twisted logic of Nazi ideology, A woman who resisted wasn't just an enemy, she was a specimen. And if you were a female fighter, especially from Eastern Europe, you were the perfect subject for an experiment. You had no legal identity, no rights, and no one waiting for you to come home. They could do anything, and they did. The Rabbits of Ravensbrück. That's what they were called. 74 young women, mostly Polish partisans and members of the resistance, became the focus of some of the most grotesque medical experiments in modern history. Why the name rabbits? Because they were treated like test animals. Because they hopped around the camp after surgeries, unable to walk, their legs misshapen by cruel incisions and infections. Because that's what the doctors called them. But they weren't animals. They were students, nurses, poets, teachers. Some were just teenagers. The experiments. The goal, the Nazis claimed, was to study infection and bone regeneration under battlefield conditions. But what it really meant was this. Incisions were made in the women's legs. Dirt, glass, and bacteria were inserted into the wounds to simulate battlefield injuries. Muscles and bones were removed without anesthesia. Limbs were broken, rebroken, and reset incorrectly. Sulfonamide drugs were tested by allowing the wounds to fester. One woman had her leg opened 12 times. Another had both legs broken and was told to walk. Most were left with lifelong disabilities. Some died from gangrene. Some died from shock. Some were executed when their usefulness ran out. A survivor speaks. One of the few survivors, Josepha H., later testified. They said it was for science. But it was for punishment. They did it because I fought. Because I held a pistol. Because I said no. Her leg was permanently damaged. But her voice remained. And she used it. Sterilization programs. Female soldiers were also targeted for forced sterilization. This was especially true for women from so-called undesirable ethnicities. Slavic women, Jewish women, Roma women, and women labeled degenerate for fighting or refusing male control. Doctors used radiation, chemical injections, invasive surgeries with no anesthesia. Many women never even knew what had been done to them, until years later, when they tried to have children and couldn't. The silence afterward. Most of these victims were never compensated. Their injuries were called psychosomatic by post-war doctors. Their pain dismissed. Their trauma ignored. And for decades, no one spoke of them. Because who wants to hear about broken women? Because the world preferred stories of heroes, not survivors with scars. But those scars are part of history. They're proof. Proof that these women were warriors. Proof that the Nazis feared them. Proof that they endured more than any human ever should, and lived. But even in the shadow of these horrors, some women resisted from within the camp. They passed messages. They sabotaged weapons. They even plotted escapes. Because you can torture a body, but you can't always break a spirit. The secret resistance, fighting back behind barbed wire. They had no guns, no maps, no chance, and still they fought. Most people believe that once the gates closed behind them, resistance ended. That the women inside Ravensbrück, starved, beaten, broken, were incapable of fighting back. But that's not the full truth. Because even in the darkest corners of that camp, even with infection in their veins and ash in their lungs, some women refused to surrender. And they did it quietly, brilliantly, dangerously. They waged a war not with weapons, but with whispers, sabotage, and secrets. It was one of the least known resistance movements of the entire war. And it began with women who had nothing left to lose. Smuggling the truth. Many of the rabbits, the women subjected to medical experiments, knew what was happening to them would never be believed. So they made a decision. If they survived, the world had to know. They stole scraps of paper from Nazi trash bins, used soot, blood, or burnt matchsticks as ink, wrote names, procedures, dates, and smuggled them out hidden in clothing or under floorboards. Some messages were stitched into hems. Others were swallowed and later retrieved. Each message was a time bomb. If caught, it meant death. But if not, it meant the world might one day remember their names. The underground network. Several captured nurses and couriers who had experience in wartime intelligence formed an underground communication ring inside the camp. They would memorize train routes and whispered rumors from guards, record the names of newly arrived prisoners and where they had come from, document the disappearance of fellow inmates. All this information was slowly passed to visiting Red Cross officials, many of whom were kept away from the worst areas, but could still be reached through coded language. It was dangerous. It was maddeningly slow, but it was working. Sabotage from within. Some female prisoners were assigned to work in Nazi factories, making weapons, uniforms, ammunition. But many of these women were resistance fighters, engineers, or farmers back home. They understood tools. They understood processes. And so they fought from the inside. They slipped sand into machine gears, sewed uniform sleeves too long or too short, filled bullets with sawdust, scratched critical calibration marks off bomb casings. To the SS, this was incompetence. To the women, it was war. A silent escape. In 1945, as Allied forces closed in, chaos erupted across Nazi Germany. Some SS guards abandoned posts. Others began mass executions to hide the evidence. But at Ravensbrück, a small group of women, led by former partisans, did something unheard of. They escaped. Not through a tunnel. Not in disguise. They walked out during a transfer operation, with forged papers and nerves of steel. A few were caught. Some were shot. But 6 made it out. And they told the world what had happened. Testimony that shook the world. At the Nuremberg trials, the testimony of female survivors from Ravensbrück played a critical role in exposing the depths of Nazi cruelty. One survivor, who had endured both forced labor and medical experiments, stood on the witness stand and said, "They took my strength, but not my story, and now it is theirs to fear." Her voice shook. The courtroom fell silent, because she wasn't just recounting pain. She was bearing witness, so no one could ever say, "We didn't know." But even after liberation, the war didn't end for these women. Because when they went home, they were met not with honors, but with silence. And for some, with shame. After the war, betrayed by the world they fought for, they survived the unthinkable. Then they were forgotten. The war ended in 1945. The camps were opened. The soldiers came home. The world celebrated. But not everyone was welcomed back. For the women who had fought, and especially those who had been captured, victory didn't bring healing. It brought silence, suspicion, and shame. Because while the world was ready to honor generals and resistance heroes, it wasn't ready to listen to broken women who had survived Nazi hands. In France, she must have slept with them. Many female resistance fighters returned home to find their reputations in ruins. Some were accused of being collaborators, because they had survived when others hadn't. One survivor, a former resistance courier who had endured months at Ravensbrück, was asked by her neighbor, "If they didn't kill you, maybe you gave them something in return." She never spoke of her experience again. In some towns, women who had been raped or tortured were deliberately excluded from post-war honors, because they embarrassed the movement. In the USSR, punished for being captured. For Soviet female soldiers, returning home was a new kind of prison. The Stalinist regime had a brutal policy. No true Soviet soldier is ever captured. Which meant that any woman who had been imprisoned by the Nazis was labeled a traitor. Survivors were interrogated by the NKVD. Some were sentenced to labor camps in Siberia. Others were denied employment, housing, or even the right to testify. They had survived Nazis, only to be destroyed by their own country. In Poland and Eastern Europe, political tides shifted quickly after the war. Many of the women who had fought with underground groups were now considered enemies of new communist regimes. Some were arrested, again. Others were forced to destroy their own records of resistance, for fear that their families would be targeted. One woman burned every diary she had kept during Ravensbrück. "They tried to erase me once," she wrote. "Now I must help them finish the job, or they will erase my children too." In the West, left out of history. In Britain and the United States, the contributions of female fighters were praised, but only selectively. Women were honored for serving as nurses, typists, or radio operators. But those who had fought with weapons, killed enemies, or sabotaged German operations, they were often left out of military history books, deemed too aggressive, not ladylike, or simply forgotten. The psychological aftermath. Beyond the silence, many women carried internal wounds no one could see. Night terrors, fertility loss, PTSD, guilt for those who hadn't survived, and the ache of knowing that the world wanted them to be quiet. Many never told their children what they had lived through. Others left behind hidden journals, photos, or scraps of fabric with names stitched inside, silent reminders of the voices they had buried to protect the people they loved. A rare moment of recognition. In 1958, a small group of surviving Ravensbrück prisoners, the Rabbits, gathered in Warsaw to commemorate their ordeal. They laid flowers at a monument made not of marble, but of stone from the camp itself. One survivor, speaking for the group, said, "We are not heroines. We are the ashes they failed to scatter." It would take decades before museums, governments, and schools began to teach their stories. But they waited, and they remembered, and because of them, so do we. There was one more fight still to come. The fight to uncover the names of the women the Nazis tried to erase. And a shocking twist. When some of the very Nazi guards who tormented them walked free. One of the last surviving Ravensbrück partisans, interviewed at 98 years old, was asked, "What would you tell today's young women about what you went through?" She looked into the camera and said, with a tremble and a smile, "I would tell them, resist early. I would tell them, don't wait to be hit before you fight. And I would tell them, don't let anyone call you weak because you are kind. We were kind. And still, we were dangerous." She passed away 3 months later. But her words live on. They were betrayed by the world they fought to protect. They were tortured, experimented on, erased. But they endured. And today, the story they were once too broken to tell is being shouted across the world. In every spoken name, every unveiled statue, every trembling page pulled from a shoebox, they return. They remind us of something simple, something powerful, that the greatest acts of courage don't always happen on battlefields. Sometimes, they happen behind barbed wire, with nothing but a whisper, a gaze, a refusal to break. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who still believes history forgot these women. Leave a comment. Which of these stories hit you the hardest? And if you're new here, this is where the untold is uncovered. Hit subscribe, because there are more stories buried beneath the ash. And together, we will bring them back.